Story 1: The Vanishing Campground. I had heard about the hidden campsite from a fellow traveler I met at a gas station in Wyoming. He said it wasn't marked on any maps and wasn't part of the official campground system. But if you were lucky enough to find it, it was breathtaking. A secret slice of heaven, he called it. I was skeptical at first, but intrigued. I loved the idea of camping away from the usual noise and crowds, so I decided to give it a shot. After all, how hard could it be? I left early in the afternoon, following the vague directions he had scribbled on a napkin. Drive past the Pinewood trailhead, take the second dirt road on the right, follow it until it forks, then go left and keep an eye out for a narrow path on the left. It sounded easy enough, but the dirt road stretched on endlessly, and the further I drove, the less confident I became. I almost turned around twice, but decided to push on. When I finally found the narrow path, the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. I parked my car and grabbed my gear, eager to set up camp before it got too dark. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and brush, but after about 20 minutes of hiking, the forest opened up to a stunning clearing. The man wasn't lying. It was perfect. The clearing was surrounded by towering pines, with a small stream cutting through one side and flat ground, perfect for pitching a tent. There were even signs that others had camped here before. An old fire pit, some makeshift benches made from logs, and even a wooden sign nailed to a tree that read, "Welcome to Heaven." I felt like I'd stumbled upon a secret, meant just for me. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked a quick dinner. The night was calm, the sky filled with stars, and the sound of the stream lulled me to sleep. It was the most peaceful night I'd had in years. But when I woke up the next morning, something was off. At first, I couldn't place it. The sunlight filtered through the trees the same way, and the air was still cool and crisp. But as I crawled out of my tent, I realized the fire pit was gone. The log benches were gone too. Even the wooden "Welcome to Heaven" sign was missing. I stood there confused, trying to convince myself I was just groggy from sleep. Maybe I was mistaken, or maybe I'd been so tired the night before that I imagined it. But the more I looked around, the more I realized the entire campsite was different. The ground was uneven, covered in rocks and weeds, not the flat, soft earth I remembered. The stream was still there, but it seemed smaller, quieter, like it had receded overnight. My tent was still pitched, my gear was untouched, but everything else was wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong here anymore. As I folded my tent and stuffed it into my pack, I noticed something on the ground. It was a charred piece of wood, barely larger than my hand. I picked it up, and my stomach dropped. It was part of the "Welcome to Heaven" sign. I hurriedly packed the rest of my gear and started back down the trail, but the path I had followed the day before seemed different. The undergrowth was thicker, the trees seemed closer together, and the air felt heavy. After what felt like an hour of walking, I finally stumbled onto the dirt road where I'd parked my car. I practically sprinted the last few steps, but when I reached the spot, my car wasn't there. Panic set in as I frantically searched up and down the road, convinced I'd just gotten turned around. But then I saw it. My car was parked about 100 yards away, in a completely different spot than where I'd left it. I don't remember moving it. As I threw my gear into the back seat and climbed into the driver's seat, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was a napkin, the same one the man at the gas station had used to write his directions. But this time, Scrawled underneath the original instructions was a single word: run. I didn't need to be told twice. I started the car and sped away, not stopping until I was miles down the highway. To this day, I don't know what happened at that campsite. Was it a prank, a hallucination, or something else entirely? All I know is that I'll never go looking for hidden places again. Some secrets are better left undiscovered. Story 2. The Bushman. I've been a search and rescue officer in the Appalachian region for over a decade. You'd think the job would desensitize you, but when it involves a missing child, something changes. There's this gnawing urgency, like every second that ticks by could be the difference between life and death. That's exactly how I felt when we got the call about a 5-year-old girl named Lily, who had wandered off during a family hike near Blue Ridge. Her parents said it happened in the blink of an eye. They turned their backs for just a second, and she was gone. The area was dense, overgrown with brush and crisscrossed with steep inclines and unmarked paths. It was the kind of place where you could get lost and never find your way out. By the time we were notified, it had already been a couple of hours. The odds weren't in our favor. My partner, Matt, and I started our search near the trailhead. We called her name until our voices felt raw. Around midday, we found a pink ribbon snagged on a branch, a few miles from where her parents last saw her. Her mother confirmed it was from Lily's hair. That ribbon was our first real clue, but the terrain was working against us. Every trail seemed to fork off into another, and the forest just swallowed you whole. By nightfall, we'd found nothing else. No footprints, no clothes, no sign she'd even been there. It was like she'd vanished. And that was the most terrifying part. The second day was worse. The volunteers who had initially shown up began trickling away. People had work, lives, responsibilities, and it became just the two of us pushing deeper into the forest. We did find something, though. One of her small white sneakers stuck in a muddy patch near a creek. It made my stomach drop. I couldn't stop imagining the worst-case scenarios. But what struck me most was the lack of any trail after that. It was like she'd just stopped walking. I started to wonder if maybe she'd been carried off by something or someone. By the third day, the family's hope had turned to despair. Matt and I were exhausted but determined to cover as much ground as we could before they officially called off the search. Around midday, we stumbled upon something I'll never forget. A massive hollowed-out tree stump, wide and deep enough to serve as a shelter. And inside, sitting cross-legged like she'd been waiting for us, was Lily. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking or screaming. She was calm, eerily calm. I knelt down, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lily, are you okay? Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "No." The Bushman kept me safe. At first, I thought she was referring to her dad or someone who had stumbled upon her. "Who's the Bushman?" I asked, exchanging a glance with Matt. Her expression didn't change. "He's my friend. He gave me berries and water. He kept the animals away." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Where is he now?" "He said he'd come back soon." Matt and I were too stunned to say much more. We got her out of there as quickly as we could and radioed it in. Back at the search site, her family was overjoyed. They hugged her, crying tears of relief. But I couldn't shake what she'd said. Who was this Bushman? And why had he left her in the tree? That night back at the station, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the hollowed-out stump, the berries, the wild look in her eyes when she talked about him. Something didn't sit right with me. I decided to go back to the site alone, which I know wasn't the smartest move. But I had to see for myself. When I got to the stump, it was just as we'd left it. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums. I positioned myself behind a cluster of thick trees, watching and waiting. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Maybe some drifter or survivalist who thought he was doing the right thing. Hours passed, and just when I was about to pack it in, I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as a figure emerged from the shadows. He didn't look like someone who was lost. He was barefoot, his clothes tattered and filthy, his hair long and matted. He carried a handful of berries, which he gently placed in the hollow. Then he froze, his head tilting like an animal sensing a predator. He glanced toward my hiding spot, and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he let out this guttural, animalistic howl that sent every hair on my body standing on end. He bolted toward me. I didn't stick around to see what he'd do. I ran, crashing through the woods, branches scraping my arms and face. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast and erratic. I didn't look back. I just kept running until I saw the faint beam of headlights cutting through the trees. It was Matt. He'd come looking for me after I missed check-in. When I told him what I saw, he thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But I know what I saw. We searched the area with backup the next morning, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no camp, nothing. Just the berries he'd left behind. To this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But the thought of him out there, wandering those woods, keeps me up at night. Story 3. A late-night drive. I was on my way back from visiting my parents, a drive I had made dozens of times. It was late, later than I intended to leave, and the route I took cut through a dense stretch of woods with no cell service and hardly any traffic. I figured if I just kept to my usual path, I'd be home in 2 hours tops. But fate, as it turns out, had other plans. About halfway through the woods, my car started acting up. First, the check engine light blinked on. Then the temperature gauge shot up. Before I could even process what was happening, smoke started billowing from under the hood. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it was just a minor issue I could solve quickly. I popped the hood, but I might as well have been looking at a foreign language. The smoke smelled awful, and the heat radiating from the engine made me step back. Frustrated, I slammed the hood shut and reached for my phone, only to see no service glaring back at me. Great. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to figure out my next move. It was pitch black outside, and the only sound was the faint rustling of trees in the wind. I thought about staying put until morning, but then I remembered passing a small gas station about 5 miles back. It was a long shot, but I figured I could walk there and hope for help. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and started walking. The road was eerily quiet, and the beam from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. People break down all the time, right? I just had to get to the gas station. About 10 minutes into my walk, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned around, shining the flashlight down the road. Nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself, picking up my pace. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer, soft, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel. My heart started pounding, and I whipped around again. Still nothing. The woods seemed to close in on me, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps had sounded too precise, too human. I kept walking, gripping the flashlight so hard, my knuckles ached. That's when I saw the figure. At first, it was just a silhouette at the edge of my flashlight's beam. It stood in the middle of the road, motionless, as if it had been waiting for me. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It was tall, wearing what looked like a heavy coat or cloak, and its face was obscured by the darkness. I backed up a step, and that's when it started walking toward me. I didn't stick around to see what it wanted. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the footsteps behind me now, fast and heavy, gaining on me with every second. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I veered off the road and into the woods, hoping to lose whoever, or whatever, was chasing me. The branches clawed at my face and arms, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step. But the footsteps kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like the gas station, a small beacon of hope in the middle of this nightmare. I pushed myself harder, practically throwing myself out of the woods and onto the gravel parking lot. The gas station was closed, but the lights inside were still on. I banged on the door, shouting for help. A few agonizing moments later, an older man in a flannel shirt unlocked the door and let me in. "What's going on?" he asked, his face a mix of concern and confusion. "Someone's following me," I managed to gasp. "They're out there." He grabbed a shotgun from behind the counter and stepped outside, shining a powerful flashlight into the woods. But there was no one there. The road was empty, and the forest was silent except for the wind. "You sure about this?" he asked, glancing back at me. I nodded, my hands trembling. "I swear, someone was chasing me." He didn't look convinced, but offered to let me stay inside until morning. I didn't argue. I sat in one of the plastic chairs near the counter, my heart still racing. The man locked the door and went back to his post behind the register, keeping an eye on the road. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every rustle outside made me jump. By the time morning came, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. The man offered to drive me back to my car, and I reluctantly agreed. When we got there, everything seemed normal. No sign of anyone or anything unusual. But the hood of my car, which had been too hot to touch the night before, was ice cold. Story 4. The Alaskan Helicopter Crash. Living in the Alaskan wilderness was something most people could never imagine. For my dad and me, it was just life, remote, quiet, and unforgiving. My dad was a search and rescue pilot, one of the best in the state. Growing up, I'd always admired him, not just because he was my dad, but because he could take on some of the harshest environments and come out unscathed. When he wasn't on a mission, he'd take me up in our personal helicopter. It was faster than driving the 2 hours into town, and honestly, it was my favorite thing in the world. That day started off normal. We needed supplies, so Dad suggested we fly into town. The weather was clear, the kind of bright, crisp winter day that makes everything sparkle. I hopped into the copter, strapped in, and we were off. The trip into town was uneventful. We grabbed groceries, fueled up, and even chatted with a few locals. Dad joked with the clerk about the price of coffee going up again. It felt like every other trip we'd made, but as we took off to head home, something felt off. About 15 minutes into the flight, the helicopter began to shudder. I glanced at Dad, and his calm demeanor had vanished. He was gripping the controls tighter than usual, his jaw set. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. Not sure, he said, his eyes darting to the instrument panel. It's losing power. Hang on. The helicopter jolted violently, and my stomach flipped. Alarms blared, and the trees below rushed toward us. Dad fought to keep us steady, but there was no saving it. Brace yourself, he shouted. The impact was deafening. The helicopter crashed into the trees, the rotors snapping like twigs. We hit the ground hard, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying sideways, still strapped into my seat. My head throbbed, and there was a sharp pain in my foot. I unbuckled myself and tumbled onto the floor of the helicopter. Groaning, I crawled to where Dad was slumped over the controls. Dad? I shook his shoulder, but he didn't respond. Blood trickled down the side of his face from a deep gash. His chest was moving, thank God. But it was shallow, and his arm was bent in a way that didn't look natural. Dad, wake up, I pleaded, shaking him harder. Still nothing. Panic set in. I tried the radio, but it was smashed. My phone had no service out here in the middle of nowhere. I was alone, and Dad needed help fast. I pulled myself out of the wreckage and tried to stand. A searing pain shot through my foot, and I collapsed. Looking down, I realized it was swollen and bent at an odd angle. Broken. I bit back tears, knowing I couldn't afford to lose it. Dad was counting on me. Gritting my teeth, I began to crawl. The forest was dense, the snow making every movement 10 times harder. My hands and knees felt like they were on fire, scraped and raw from the rough ground. Every few minutes, I stopped to call out, "Help! Is anyone there?" But my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the woods. Time lost all meaning. The pain in my foot was unbearable, but I couldn't stop. Dad's face kept flashing in my mind. Unconscious, broken, dying. I had to keep going. At one point, I came across a stream and drank greedily, the icy water stinging my throat. My hands were shaking and my breath came out in short, visible bursts. I felt myself growing weaker with every passing minute. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped sharply. I was completely unprepared for the cold, wearing nothing more than a jacket and jeans. I knew the night could kill me if I didn't find help soon. By the time I collapsed onto my back, I was ready to give up. My body was screaming for rest, and my mind was spiraling into hopelessness. I stared up at the darkening sky, tears streaming down my face. This was it. But then I heard it. A voice. "Hey, the kid is over here." I blinked, thinking I was hallucinating. But then I saw them. 3 men emerging from the trees. They looked rugged, dressed in heavy jackets and boots. One of them knelt beside me, his face lined with concern. "You okay, kid?" he asked. I crashed. My dad's hurt. The helicopter." My words tumbled out incoherently. "Don't worry, we saw it go down," another man said. "We've already radioed search and rescue. Let's get you warmed up." They helped me to my feet, careful not to put weight on my injured foot. I leaned on one of them as they guided me back through the woods. They assured me that my dad was alive and that they'd found him still in the helicopter. Relief washed over me, though I was still terrified for him. It felt like hours before the sound of a helicopter filled the air. The search and rescue team had arrived. They loaded me onto a stretcher and checked me over before flying me to the nearest hospital. I couldn't stop shaking, from both the cold and the shock. Dad was brought in shortly after me. He had a broken arm, a concussion, and some cracked ribs, but the doctors said he'd make a full recovery. Seeing him alive and breathing was the greatest relief I'd ever felt. The crash changed everything for me. It was the closest I'd ever come to death, and it made me realize how fragile life is. As for Dad, He was back in the pilot's seat within a year, but we never took another joyride together. To this day, I can't step into a helicopter without hearing the sound of those trees rushing toward us, or feeling the cold, unrelenting grip of the Alaskan wilderness. But I'll always be grateful for the strangers who found me that day, and for the sheer willpower that kept me moving forward. Thanks so much for listening to Nightmare Narratives. We hope you enjoyed these truly terrifying stories. If you did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you'll know when we post new videos every Tuesday and Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear read on the channel, email us at officialnightmarenarratives@gmail.com, and you might just hear your story in a future episode. Thanks again for listening, and stay spooky, friends. We'll catch you in the next one.